Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. It's not really RAF week. It's one show that will be added to my collective RAF week content. But anyway, Stuart Burbridge joins us to present on a World War II TV version of his Wolverhampton MA dissertation, a course he took under the tutelage and over umbrella organisation of the fantastic John Buckley and others. And we'll be talking night fighters, Bomber Harris, and the key points of this often overlooked campaign. So I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Stuart. You've made that transition from sidebar to guest historian. Others have done it. Others will do it in the future. How does it feel coming on being a guest this time?
It feels good. I mean, thank you very much for letting me do this. Yeah, it's a bit different, bit intimate. I'm normally on the other side, obviously, and we'll see how it goes. But yeah, please be kind to me.
So you'll explain. You've got this interest in the RAF and you've got interest in night fighters. So because it feels a bit of a niche subject. Night people, when they're interested in the RAF, it's either Spitfires and Hurricanes in the Battle of Britain, or it's generally the big heavies and bombing the big cities. But everything else seems to, despite the work of James Jeffries and Matt Bowe and all these others, seems to get a kind of a second level of attention. So why night fighters and that particular campaign?
Well, I mean, I was always going to do something on Bomber Command for my dissertation because it's my sort of major area of interest in terms of the Second World War, family reasons, which I can explain in a minute. But the reason why I chose night fighters is because I was looking for something that hadn't really been covered before. Yeah. I'm following an example here of Jane Gulliford-Lowes, who had a family interest in mine laying, and she was able to find a topic that hadn't been looked at. And I remembered, I've got the book here. I remembered about 15, 20 years ago, I bought this book here. American Skies. I don't know whether anyone's read it before, but it's an absolutely fantastic memoir. It's written by a chap called Michael Allen, who, together with his pilot Harry White, was a successful night fighter crew. They went right from the very start. They were even involved in turbine lights, which is I won't explain that now because it'll take too long. But if anyone wants to look it up, it was a fantastic British solution to a problem that didn't exist.
And, we're good at that, us Brits.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were actually, at one point, they were on 29 Squadron, which was commanded in 1941 by Guy Gibson, who was not only a bomber pilot, although obviously that's what he's well known for, but he was actually nearly a night fighter ace. He shot down 3 German aircraft in a Beaufighter and 1 probable. So he was just 1 off being an ace, really, or 2 off being an ace, I suppose you could say. And funny enough, actually, he said that that Guy Gibson's got this reputation of being quite standoffish and not very interested in NCOs and a bit sort of snobby. But they said he was a great bloke and he was quite happy to drink with them at the bar and all the rest of it. So but it's a really good book, and I read it years ago, and I thought to myself, hang on a second, I don't think anyone's really written about this. So I went back and revisited it, and then I went on Amazon and bought a couple more books from Amazon that were night fighting memoirs, and I then realised this is quite an untapped resource. Really, it's a story that's not been told. And if you look at the histories of Bomber Command, if you look at the history of Bomber Command, then night fighters don't really get a mention. 100 Group occasionally gets a mention because they talk about electric countermeasures, but the night fighter aspect of 100 Group, it's been ignored.
Yeah, so definitely.
Yeah, so I figured that was my subject, and that was what I could look at. So that's how I came to doing the subject, and it's been a big part of my life for the last 18 months or so. I've done a lot of reading, done a lot of research. I've been to the National Archives 3 times. I've got to go back there again at least twice because the amount of material there is just it's huge. It's enormous.
Well, that's the thing. When people like you, yourself and Jane, others kind of go down new paths because they haven't been trodden before, you find the fact there's lots of stuff there to examine, lots of stuff that takes you down more research routes, and then we're hoping this will be a book in sometime in the future. But that's the future.
Absolutely. Yeah,
let's bring up the PowerPoint. Folks, kind of fire away with questions, or I think you'll find that Stuart covers a lot of it as we go along. But yeah, hunting the hunters. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So this was my topic. I completed my dissertation in January and submitted it, and it's been marked. I got it back, and it was a good one, thankfully. Thanks to John Buckley, he seemed to like it. So he actually told me
as I think we start calling John Buckley.
So he actually told me at We Have Ways Fest last summer. We met for a coffee. He was obviously talking there, and he said this is a subject that really would go down well as a book. So that's when I first got the idea, which I probably would have thought of anyway. And that's the way I'm sort of looking towards it now.
Brilliant.
So again, it's a subject where you have rabbit holes and you go down them and you realize all of a sudden that this is a much bigger subject than you ever thought it was. So the RAF's offensive Nightfighter campaign over Europe, 43-45, was quite a defined start date, which is quite handy, because although night fighting carried on throughout most of the Second World War, a lot of it was defensive in nature. Certainly from the British and German side of it, it was defensive in nature. It was a reaction. Aircraft come over into your airspace and you shoot them down. And what made this one different is that it was fighter on fighter. So the British, the RAF, were the only organisation during the war, and I don't know whether this has happened since because I'm not an expert on more modern conflicts, but they were the only ones who actually went out to shoot down their opposite numbers and not the bombers. And I'll explain the reasons for that and why it became necessary. So I think probably that's it next time. Well, again, what made it easy for me when I was doing this is that there is a very definite start date, and this start date was the 2nd December 1942. We can be quite precise about that. I'll tell the story of how this all came about. So 1474 Special Duties flight, based RAF Gransden Lodge in Cambridgeshire, and they flew Wellingtons. And on the 2nd of December, they took off from their airfield. There'd been a raid earlier that night on Frankfurt, 112 aircraft. And it was expected, because of the weather conditions over the target, that they would be night fighters. That night fighters would appear and would attempt to engage the bombers. So the idea of this is that these 6 guys here, 5 Canadians, it was a Canadian crew. The special operator was a former school teacher called Harold Jordan, who was the only non-Canadian. He was an Englishman, and his job was to monitor his electronic equipment and ascertain the wavelength of the airborne interceptor radar the Germans were believed to be using. I say they were believed to be using. What had happened is earlier on in 1940, well, in the preceding few months, the Y listening stations had been picking up on a reference to something called Emil by the German night fighter crews, and they weren't sure, but they believed it was a new airborne interceptor radar. And the reason why they were using airborne interceptor radars at that time is because the new German night fighters used to be ground controlled, so they didn't have radars in the aircraft. They were ground controlled. The ground controller would tell the fighter where to go. They'd find the enemy, engage them, shoot them down in theory. But when Bomber Harris took over in February 1942, he began to throw his weight around a little bit. And the first 1,000 bomber raid, in fact, the only 1,000 bomber raid, because the other 1,000 bomber raids weren't 1,000 bomber raids, but the one that was against Cologne on the 30th of May 1942. And they used the new technique of the bomber stream, which was effectively what it sounds like. It was a stream of aircraft in a row. Some of these bomber streams were sort of 60, 70 miles long, and they would attempt to overwhelm the defenses, because what had happened with the ground control system is that you had Germany divided up into, or Europe divided up into a system of boxes, and each box would contain a fighter, and each fighter would be ground controlled. This meant that only one fighter the fighter could only engage one aircraft at the same time, because it just didn't have the facility to actually attack anymore. And this system was called the Himmelbett system, brought in by a chap called Kamhuber, who was in charge of the defense of the Reich at the time. So that worked well when aircraft were sent out singly, as they had been previous to the adoption of the bomber stream. They were basically told, "This is your target tonight. Off you go. Come back when you've done it." And they had to make their own way to the target, which obviously was why the Himmelbett system was established, because it was easy to control single aircraft. The bomber stream came in and completely it made it obsolete. So the Germans then had to start using airborne interceptor radar in order to attack individual aircraft in the bomber stream. And so going back to the reason for this mission, Emil was identified, and it was believed to be a German airborne interceptor radar. And the only way in which they could find out the frequency that it was being used and to confirm that it was by being attacked. So effectively, these guys and the 2 other aircraft from their flight who were basically bait. They were there to be attacked, and hopefully not get shot down. But chances are they would be. This was actually the 18th time they'd gone up to try and be attacked, and this was the 18th time lucky. So over the target, Harold Jordan's got his headphones on, and he hears this ticking in his headphones, and this tells him that they've been picked up by a night fighter. So he tells the crew, "I think we're going to be attacked. It's getting louder and louder. Gunners, keep a watch out and tell us what you see." So no sooner he'd done that than the cannon shells started to rip into the fuselage, and out of the 6 crew, 4 were injured. They were attacked 11 times. And the pilot, thankfully, was unwounded. And somehow they managed to evade the night fighter, which was a Ju-88, as identified by one of the gunners. And they managed to shake it off. Really badly damaged aircraft. They managed to get back across the North Sea, and they made landfall on the Kent coast near Ramsgate. The decision was taken that they were going to have to ditch the aircraft. They had sent the details back by wireless to the UK already, but they weren't sure they'd been received. So the guy who was really badly injured, Biggery, he'd been shot in his legs, both his legs, and he couldn't get out. If the aircraft was going to ditch, he wasn't going to be able to make it in time. So what they decided to do was put a parachute on him, and he'd jump out of a Ramsgate with the information on him that he could hand to the authorities. And he did this. So he jumped out of a Ramsgate, landed safely, and was taken to hospital. And the aircraft then ditched about 400 yards from where I'm sat now. I live in Kingstown, which is on the Kent coast between Deal and Dover, and the aircraft came down. Apparently you can still see it. Apparently at low tide you can still see it. I never have, and I only found this out recently when I was investigating, when I was doing this, because I had no idea of the connection to where I lived to the story. And a local fisherman picked them up and took them to the hospital, and they were all, apart from one, I don't know why Everett Vachon wasn't decorated, but the rest of them were all decorated. No, sorry, it was Grant who wasn't decorated. The rest of them were all decorated, and Air Marshal Sir Charles Portal wrote them a personal letter thanking them for their courage and thanking them for the information that they brought back. And I don't know about anybody else, but people have received VCs for less than that. And
absolutely.
And, staggering courage and staggering bravery, setting yourself up as a target. I really. And this is where it all started. So now, the Telecommunications Research Establishment was now in possession of the fact that A, it was an airborne interceptor radar, and B, they knew the frequency, so they could now start doing something about it. And the reason why we have the slide of Bill Biggery is because he was the one who was wounded in the legs and bailed out of a Ramsgate, and he was the only member of the crew who didn't survive the war. Unfortunately, I just thought I'd put his picture up. He was killed on the 28th of April 1944, raiding Friedrichshafen, and with 7th Squadron, and he's buried at Dürnbach War Cemetery in Bavaria, which I think you were telling me before we went on live.
Got a cousin buried there,
yeah. So I just thought I'd pay a tribute to him, very brave man, as were all his crew. And
fantastic story to start it all off. And it's that it's so often. I had a discussion with a couple of people the other day, is that most historians, it's that little personal thing that something sparked something happened near you. You knew a guy at school whose dad was this, a teacher was that, and that's that kind of story that brings it all around. So so that's the start of it. So on we go.
What we need to do, I think, now is to look at Bomber Command in 1942, because 1942 was the year when it changed beyond all recognition. If you look at how Bomber Command was, the shape it was in January 1942, and you look at December 1942, you've got virtually 2 different organisations. And this obviously has a root in why we needed to start taking the fight back to the night fighters. So if you look at 1942, you've got a very demoralised organisation that's just basically been ripped to pieces by the Butt Report in the previous August, and they've basically said that what you're doing, you're not doing it right. You're I think it was one in 3 aircraft were getting within 5 miles of the target, and they were doing very little damage. And obviously this is propaganda gold for the Germans, and they're losing men, they're losing colleagues, they're losing aircraft, and for no particular gain at all. So obviously there are political connotations as well in that Stalin, from day one, since Barbarossa, he'd been badgering the British at this point to do something to take the pressure off him. And of course, Bomber Command was the only thing that at the time they could really do that would directly impact Germany. And it was fairly obvious that that they were failing in their task. There was no clear doctrine target. Like I've said already, bombers were sent out individually to their targets, which was a really ineffective way of operating. The US wasn't obviously. The US had been in the war for 3 weeks, and the 8th Air Force hadn't even been formed at that point. So they were very much still on their own. You got the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, who was Richard Pearce. His leadership was ineffective, and it was directionless. You had a reliance on aircraft that were basically obsolete in 1941, 1940-41. You had the Hamdens still being used, Whitleys, and the Manchester, which was a huge disappointment. And the raids were small scale in terms of what was to follow, and minimal damage to targets at great cost. And the morale was awful. It was a terrible place to be. It was not a good organisation to belong to in January 42. And if you fast forward then to the end of the year, things have changed an awful lot. So you've got a clearly defined area bombing doctrine. You've got Harris, who took over in February 1942. Strong, determined leadership. He was, he saw Bomber Command as his organisation, and he was going to make sure that he was going to, fight for it. The bomber stream tactic was implemented, as I mentioned already, for the at the end of May for the first 1,000 bomber raid. You've got the arrival of the US 8th Air Force in theatre, which meant that then the Germans were under added pressure because they were being bombed round the clock. Although obviously at this stage they weren't going to Germany; they were mainly just attacking targets in France, getting themselves their feet under the table. The bombers had gone. The Hamdens and Whitleys had been phased out. You've got larger raids on German targets. Very importantly, you've got the Avro Lancaster, which Harris was absolutely mad about, to complement the Halifax and the Stirlings as a heavy bomber force. So you've now got 3 types of 4-engine bombers, albeit 2 of them perhaps were the Halifax Mark 1 wasn't so great, and the Stirling wasn't so great. Although, funny enough, their crews loved it. I knew a Stirling flight engineer who was shot down on Lancasters later on in the war, and he loved the Stirling. He thought it was fantastic. He absolutely loved it. Wouldn't hear a thing against it, but it wasn't a very.
I think that's a general thing about the British RAF vets I've met is whatever aircraft they ended up using, be it transport, fighter, bomber, is they tended to stay very loyal to it, to their Whitleys, their Stirlings, their Halifaxes, their whatever it would be, both fighters, both. It just seems maybe a British loyalty thing to the kind of the not necessarily the first aircraft, but one that they were with the longest. I think it's very common. I think Americans as well. I think.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't fly very high. It was a sitting duck really, but he managed to do a tour on them, so he wouldn't hear anything against it. And you've got greater damage being done to the targets and cities now, and you've got new technology and navigation, very important. G and oboe, which were helping the aircraft find their targets in a way that they weren't able to do 12 months previously. So everything's improving. Bomber Command is now a credible organisation that's actually doing a job. But that comes at a price, and the price was that the Germans responded. And what I've done here is I've gone through the Nightfighter claims archive, and I've dug out every German Nightfighter claim. So this is just Nightfighters. This isn't flak. If you were talking about flak and accidents, you can probably add another half onto that. And you're looking at loss rates. I mean, you can see obviously November's an anomaly because they only flew 4 operations in November because of the weather. But you're looking at some substantial loss rates. And like I say, if you add flak claims onto that, then you're getting up around over 5% in December of 42. And acceptable losses were deemed to be 5%. If loss rates exceeded 5% over a 3-month period, that was unacceptable. If loss rates exceeded 7%, that was deemed to be unsustainable. Overall, throughout the entire war, loss rates were 2.2%. A lot of that was because because of this the offensive Nightfighter campaign and other factors, they were losing very few bombers in the last year of the war. So that brought it down a bit. But as you can see, the losses are rising, and something had to be done about it. Losses over Germany were always higher, by the way. It was 5.1% average over Germany. When I say 2.2, that includes Italian targets, French targets, Belgian targets. Over Germany, it was normally 5 point. It was over 5. Nuremberg Raid, which I'll talk about in a minute too. That's 11.8%. But that was a freak show. That didn't happen all the time.
A good question just about German claims from Gaza there. How much overclaiming was there in the German figures? Because obviously, well, I say obviously, I'm assuming that there were some of the numbers published perhaps at the time in propaganda were higher than what have been the work of people over these last few years, is to say take the original claims and then so this is I'm assuming based on the more modern research.
Yeah. What you have to obviously, most bombers that were claimed by the Nightfighters did actually they weren't shot down over the sea. They actually landed in occupied Europe, so they landed in German-controlled territory. But they were actually very careful about their claims, and you have cases of sometimes kills aren't actually credited to a crew for months because they're being really careful about making sure that they can identify. So to answer the question, German claims were pretty spot on. They were pretty good. They didn't overclaim as much as the RAF did. And when I say the RAF, I'm talking about the Battle of Britain. You know, when September the 15th, 175 aircraft being shot down. We know that was nonsense. We know it was about 4 times higher than it actually was. But the Germans were pretty good. They were pretty good, pretty thorough about their claims, and they're quite. It's a reliable database, and I think everyone would agree that it's far more acceptable to make draw your conclusions from that than it is from certain sources. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So as you can see, we're losing quite a few aircraft, and something's got to be done about it. So the information that was brought back from the mission to Frankfurt mines by the Edward Portman crew, it went to the technical research establishment in Malvern. And they came up with two. They came up with two devices to assist. Firstly was window, which everybody was actually developing at the time, even the Japanese in the Pacific. In fact, I believe the Japanese were the first to use window. But window, obviously, if people who don't know, window was I'm sure most do, were strips of foil that were cut to the same length as the waves of the radar. So in this case, obviously, it was I think it was 10 centimeters, and they would be chucked out, and they would aim to overwhelm, blind the defenses. The Germans had window as well. They called it Doppel, but they didn't use it. The British used it first on a major scale. So that was the first thing. The second thing was a device called Serrate. Serrate was a homing device. It wasn't a radar. It was a homing device. It was designed to work with the radar system, and it used the same screen. And you've got the crew of a bow fighter. It was a bow fighter at this stage. You've got the crew of a bow fighter. You've got the pilot and the navigator, radar operator, NAVOP for short. And so the pilot's job is to fly the aircraft, obviously, to navigate the aircraft once they're over enemy territory, and to operate the weapon system to shoot the target down. The NAVOP's job is to identify the target and guide the pilot towards it. So in the bow fighter, he's in the back of the aircraft, and he has a screen. And you have a Mark IV airborne interceptor radar screen, and Serrate used the same screen. There was a switch on the side that meant you could move between the two. The area you see on the bow fighter there, that's actually Mark IV airborne interceptor radar, not Serrate. So Serrate difficult. It's not visible on that picture, but you also had backwards facing radar as well, which is very important. I'll explain why. So you had a sort of 360-degree coverage, or as good as you could get. And the idea behind Serrate is that it would identify when a fighter was not a night fighter was using its airborne interceptor radar. So it was a homing device. It would tell the pilot or tell the NAVOP which direction to fly in order to try and eventually pick up this aircraft. But the only problem is it couldn't tell range and it couldn't tell height. So that's why you still needed your Mark IV radar, because the idea would be, and if you go on to the next slide there, Paul. Next, I've done this out of sync slightly. The next one after that, I think we'll come back to that one. So it could detect the Serrate radar could detect enemy aircraft at 100 miles range, but it couldn't provide height or range, just direction. So it was used in conjunction with the Mark IV radar. Mark IV radar had a range of about 2.5 miles. So it was a very hit and miss system. So you'd pick up a reading and you'd fly towards it, and then hopefully you'd come within range. Hopefully you'd be able to get to the right height, and you'd work out where it is, and you'd be able to come into contact with that aircraft. It was extremely difficult to use. It did work, and it was first operated in June of 1943 by 141 Squadron of Fighter Command, who were they were one of the two squadrons of Defiance that got knocked about in the Battle of Britain, and then they were basically withdrawn from frontline duties and became a night fighter squadron. By the time this happened, they were flying bow fighters, so they ditched their Defiance. And the debut of Serrate was on the 15th of June 1943, and the lucky crew, I say lucky crew, it wasn't lucky, it was skill, was the crew of John Braham, or Bob Braham as he was known, and Bill Gregory, who was known as Sticks. They went out with Serrate on the very first night. They shot down a ME-110 over Staveren in the Netherlands, 10,000 feet, and they proved that it worked. Basically, they came across this aircraft. They went close enough for it to be picked up on Mark IV radar. They were sort of masquerading as a bomber. So the aircraft, the 110 was interested, and it kind of approached them behind. They then whipped behind it and shot it down from behind. So you can imagine how surprised and how amazed that night fighter crew must have felt when all of a sudden what they thought they were attacking actually turned out to be a bow fighter that was attacking them, and it shot them down. So they proved that it worked. Between the 15th of June 1943 and the advent or the founding of the 100 Group in November 1943, there were 23 Serrate kills. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously this is a new system that's sort of being used. But as I said already, it's a very difficult system to use. And 19 of these 23 Serrate kills were actually courtesy of the same three crews. So Braham and Gregory got 9. And 2 of the crews got 5 each, and that basically left 4 to be shared out between the rest of the squadron. So it was difficult to use. It was only the very best crews were able to actually get much mileage out of it.
And I think it's worth underlining that, because I've seen a couple of things on YouTube talking about things like G. I don't think I've seen one on Serrate, but they're always kind of like it's a magic gadget that these crews can just switch on and it suddenly detects everything and does all the work for them. No, it's not 2025 with Guy did this. It's a system that helps a skilled crew who are in the right place doing the right thing refine their ability to do their job. But it's not an autopilot solution thing. I think some people the tech was really important, but it's tech in conjunction with incredibly well trained, naturally gifted flyers who are able to get the best out of the system. So I think it's worth underlining that, because it's not just the tech, folks.
No, absolutely not. And it like I say, it was difficult, and most people didn't get much change from it. It was only the few crews that were able to, and of course, Serrate was more or less obsolete by then in 1943 because the Germans switched and they replaced Liechtenstein, which was Emil. If you go back a slide, sorry, Paul, I know I didn't start out of order.
Yep.
That's the radar that the Serrate Homer was designed to sort of lock into. And you're probably more familiar, people are probably more familiar with seeing night fighters with a forest of aerials, much bigger than that. For example, the aircraft that you see in the RAF Museum in Hendon, they have huge forests of aerials, and that was SN2. That wasn't Emil. So as soon as the Germans replaced this with their new iteration, Serrate effectively was shut out. It was no good anymore. But they kept on using it, and they had this the authorities, the RAF had this really weird relationship with Serrate. They were desperate for it to work so much that they carried on using it, even though the figures were coming back in every month that they weren't getting anything at all from it. So by 1943, effectively Serrate had its day. It was good. It had provided a shock, and it had basically taught the Nachtjagd, the Luftwaffe, that they were being hunted themselves. But ultimately, as with everything, it's one side does something, another side then does something else, and another side does something else to get ahead in the race. And by 1943, Serrate was worthless. So So in November the 11th, 1943, 100 Bomber Support Group was formed, and this was a real landmark in the story of night fighting, because for the first time you had an organisation that was taken under the wing of Bomber Command. Previously, obviously, when 141 Squadron were doing their thing with Serrate, they were still part of Fighter Command. They had no links to Bomber Command. They were under the umbrella, but it was decided that Bomber Command needed to be in control of their night fighter force. Not just their night fighter force, they were also, you can probably see there on the badge, it's the motto of 100 Group is confound and destroy. So confounding was electronic countermeasures, it was jamming, it was deception. They were using B-17s for that. B-17s, Halifaxes. B-17s were used because the internal bomb bay was just the right size to house the equipment. So the RAF managed to get hold of a number of B-17s, which they used right up into the end of the war. Mm. And 100 Group was formed under the control of Air Vice Marshal Edward Addison, who's a bit of a forgotten hero. He stayed with 100 Group right to the end of the war. He was never replaced. He oversaw the entire existence of the group. So you had 3 Serrate squadrons, and so you had 141, which was joined by 239 and 169. Who became operational in January 44. And obviously at the start, there was just one ECM squadron, which was 192 Squadron. But this was the start, I think, of it being taken seriously. One of the problems that they had in November 1943 is that the Battle of Berlin had started. And the Beaufighter, although we love the Beaufighter, it's a fantastic aircraft, and it had an awful lot going for it. It wasn't fast enough to keep up with enemy night fighters in a chase. And it also didn't have the range to operate on the far side of Germany. If you're taking the fight to Berlin, you're going to need an aircraft that can go there with you.
Because I was just going to say that this, for me, in my limited understanding of this, is that this sort of night fighter operations, as the name of the show today is, it kind of blurs the line between what is attack and what is defense, because you're getting defensive operations taking place outside of Britain, and the Germans are doing defensive stuff. It's sort of, we have in our head our definitions of what is offensive. Going and dropping bombs on Berlin is offensive. Fighters defending against attacks coming is different. But this really is sort of something in between. It's both and neither at the same time, isn't it? It's as you've been saying, it's like an entirely separate field of combat where technology and out teching each other is paramount.
Absolutely, it is. I mean, I like to draw a bit of a parallel between the Battle of the Atlantic and the Nightfighter campaign, because this becomes apparent later on when we start looking at December 1944, but which was the crux month, which I'll come on to. But it's the hunter, as the title of this, it's the hunter becoming the hunted.
Yeah.
And bombers were never hunters. Bombers were there to drop bombs on people, and the hunters were hunting the bombers. And now the British turned it on their head, and now started doing the same thing to the night fighters. It was the last thing they expected. So yeah, but I think, as far as I'm aware, that this was the only time when you had an offensive night fighter campaign. Nobody else. The Americans in the Pacific, the Americans in the Mediterranean did engage in night fighting, and even there was even some night fighter, defensive night fighter action in Northwest Europe, which sort of came into play during the Battle of the Bulge. But this was an entirely new system of fighting, and no one had ever done it before. And 100 Group was the start of it, effectively.
And Trevor Sheehan just said, assuming that the security must have been really high and tough in this kind of, if you're dealing with a lot of top secret stuff, I'm assuming these guys had to be really careful what they say and what they say in pubs and what access they have to this tech, So
absolutely,
make sure that any advantage is kept as a secret.
Yeah, and one of the after Nuremberg, I'll just mention it very briefly. After Nuremberg, we had the RAF had centimetric radar, and they had it for a while. Centimetric radar obviously is a radar that's small enough to fit inside the fuselage, and it's got a scanner, and it's a far better, far more effective system of detecting than non-centimetric radar, which the Mark IV AI was. But they wouldn't release that for use over the continent, because they were worried what would happen if it was shot down and it was recovered by the Germans, and what the Germans would make of it. But I'll come on to that when I talk about Nuremberg in a minute.
Yep.
So yes. Yes, Nuremberg. I know you did a very good presentation a year ago with Dan Ellin about Nuremberg on the anniversary, and I think most people would know that Nuremberg was a disaster. It was the RAF's second Schweinfurt. It was a catastrophe. Everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. Now we're used to seeing B-17s, B-24s with contrails in the sky. That actually happened on the night of the Nuremberg Raid. It never usually happened, and because we had bright moonlight, you had weather conditions that weren't as they were supposed to be. The predicted winds were wrong. You had a bizarre route, which was a long leg across southern Germany from Charleroi to Schweinfurt, which was 260 miles long, and it was along this outward bound long leg that most of the losses took place. I think I counted on the map 61 Lancasters and Halifaxes were shot down on that long leg. And if you think about it, I did this afternoon, and my mind was wandering, and I was working out that it would have taken a heavily laden Lancaster about an hour and 20 minutes to fly that particular leg from one to the end, and they lost 61, which means that they were basically losing a bomber to night fighters every 80 seconds. Seven men taking out the picture every 80 seconds. It's ridiculous. And obviously 97 were destroyed in total, and more in crashes when they got back to their bases back in England. And they were mostly night fighter attacks. Flak claimed very little on that particular night. 247 Luftwaffe night fighters were active, and almost all made contact with the bomber stream because effectively they had it presented them on a plate. 1700 group night fighters were operational. The reason why 17 were operational was because they were doing refits. Basically, when 100 group had been formed, they'd been given some lousy airframes by Fighter Command and lousy engines, and they were losing crews who were basically disappearing into the North Sea because the engines and the airframes weren't fit for purpose. And we love the Mosquito as well, fantastic aircraft, but one of its few flaws, is that it flies like a brick on one engine. So if you lose an engine, you're really struggling. And they were losing a lot of night fighter crews, a lot of experienced night fighter crews to technical faults, who were landing in the North Sea and not making it back. So as a result, in the spring, you had a huge problem whereby, not a problem, but a lot of refits, a lot of aircraft were being taken away to have their engines taken out and replaced, and a lot of the airframes were being maintained. So not very many were available on that particular night. 17 night fighters were from 100 group were operational, and the Germans lost 5 fighters, 4 from return fire, and one claimed by 100 group by 239 Squadron Mosquito. So if you look at the map, you'll see what I mean about the long leg, which is that you can see it there from just south of Brussels to just north of the target. And the spoof raids, you can see that there are some spoof raids that have been indicated there. They didn't work. They didn't fool anybody. And it was a catastrophe. And
but it's as we've discussed so many times on this channel, it's often through the disasters where the learning curve is incredibly steep, but decisions have to be made, things had to be changed, and it's a shitty way of finding out how better to do things. But it is amazing how many times in World War II something that goes really wrong then actually ends up turning everything and becoming a point where things do improve, and that's obviously what you're going to explain.
This was absolutely it. Yeah. Well, I mean, so the next slide is a photograph which was taken from the cockpit of a 110, and that's what they saw. That's what the Nachtjagd saw that night. And there aren't any bombers on there, but you can just imagine that they would stand out like a sore thumb, particularly if they're issuing contrails as well. They were just ripe for the picking, and unfortunately that's what happened. So Nuremberg was an absolute disaster, and but it was a catalyst. Everything good, as you said, Paul. Everything good sprang from there. Now, this was where it was interesting at the National Archives, because I dug out a lot of files, and for about a week after the Nuremberg Raid, there was nothing. There were no letters, no memos, no meetings, nothing. And I can only assume that this was the period of time in which they were counting the cost, getting all the DVDs together, trying to work out what had happened. And then on the 7th of April, Bomber Harris sat down at his desk in High Wycombe and wrote a letter. And this letter was game changer. I mean, I can read out what's on there. The small effort of night fighter aircraft, which is all that 100 Group can at present provide for the support of the bombers, is not large enough to have even a serious nuisance value against the German night fighter force. he's repeatedly pointed out that the strength of the defences would reach this is an important part of the letter, actually. The strength of the defences would reach a point at which the night bombing attacks by existing methods and types of heavy bomber would involve percentage casualty rates which could not in the long run be sustained. We've not yet reached that point, but tactical innovations which have so far postponed it and now practically exhausted it. So that basically is Harris, who never admitted to doing anything wrong, saying we've screwed up. The Battle of Berlin is a failure, and we're in trouble. We are really in trouble, and something's got to be done about it. So the only remedy is the provision of night fighter support on a substantial scale. And he asked for 10 night fighter squadrons, which he never actually got in the end, but he asked for 10 night fighter squadrons. And this is the point that I was talking about earlier with the security. He argued that that all mosquitoes be fitted with Mark 8 airborne interceptor radar. Mark 8 was was British centimetric radar. There was a US version called Mark 10, which was even better than Mark 8. Which was also being used as well, but they weren't using it over hostile territory for fear of compromising before Overlord. Okay, and Harris said this again is surely an inadequate ground for withholding protection from our bombers. I've seen the letter, and he's actually scrubbed some bits out that are even stronger than that, which probably would have caused a bit of.
It's very British, though. It's slightly kind of passive aggressive, isn't it? It's not. He's not kind of raising his voice as such, but it's a very, very British, like the kind of cliched letter to the Times that middle-aged men write, isn't it? Furthermore, sirs, I draw your attention too. It's I
mean, if you've ever seen any of Harris's correspondence, it is quite funny, really, because you can actually you know the sort of guy he is, and I mean he gets into arguments, and I remember they wanted to take one of his squadrons away to do dive V1 duties, and he said, well, I take my orders from Schaeff. I take my orders from Eisenhower. I can't just say yes to any. And Trafford Lee Mallory writes some letter saying, just Arthur, just stop it. Okay, you're being an awkward sod. Just stop it. So yeah, reading Harris's correspondence is quite entertaining. But so Nuremberg's never mentioned by name. Never ever mentioned by name. I've never seen any correspondence that mentions what happened there. Directly. So. This letter is received, and to be fair to them, they acted on it really, really quickly. A meeting was called at the Air Ministry on the 20th of April, so sort of 2 weeks afterwards, and almost everything that Harris asked for was granted. So they agreed to release Mark 10 AI for use over occupied territory because their theory was that the Germans have probably got centimetric radar. In any case, and if an aircraft is shot down, if the Germans are able to sort of salvage the equipment, it'll probably take them 9 months to do anything with it, to do anything properly with it. And by that time, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll have finished the war by then.
Yeah.
So they agreed to do that. The Americans were consulted because it was their system, and they said, yeah, that's fine, no problem at all. 2 squadrons went straight to 100 group, bringing their strength up to after Overlord, so that brings it up to 5. Then 1 squadron was transferred from Schlesser's Mediterranean Air Force directly. So you've got 7, because you've got 7 in total. And those are the squadrons that now were under the Bomber Command umbrella: 141, 239, 169, 515. 515 was a specialist intruder squadron. So they were the ones that went down and shot at the airfields and shot at the aircraft trying to land, and because this is a job that they'd done in fighter command, so it was decided that they were best to carry on. So all these decisions were made within 3 weeks of Nuremberg. So we don't sometimes, things aren't agreed quickly, but this was certainly done post haste because they recognised just how important it was to actually put emphasis on.
It shows us now, reminds us now, 80 years on, what clout Bomber Harris had. He was kind of riding high, I suppose. He was able to get the voice of people that mattered. He's got lots of debates about what kind of a guy he was and his methodology and his doctrine. But he certainly had clout at this point of the war still to get things done.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've lost my thread. I've lost my thread here. But one of the things I was going to say about the Nuremberg raid is it's very obviously as you said, good things come from bad. But it was very lucky that it happened when it did, because if the disaster over Nuremberg had happened 2 months previously, then I don't know what would have happened. As it was, on the 14th of April, Bomber Command the control of Bomber Command was handed over to Schaeff for the pre-invasion preparation to soften up the transport system in and else and other things in Europe prior to D-Day, prior to Overlord. So it gave them the opportunity to sort of like stand back a little bit, lick their wounds. And I mean, there were still tough targets in France. Marie-le-Comte was one that was a shock to the system. When they attempted to bomb a panzer training area just east of Paris, and again, all sorts of things went wrong. There were communication issues. They were too long over the target. The night fighters were able to get stuck in, and they shot down quite a few. But by and large, it took the pressure off Bomber Command a little bit, because they weren't bombing Germany. They weren't doing deep penetration raids into Germany, and so they were able, like the Americans after the second Schweinfurt raid, they were able to take a step back, regroup,
a bit of breathing space.
Absolutely. And so it happened at just the right time, really. If it had to happen at all, it was a good thing it happened at the end of March and not the end of January, because that would have really caused problems.
And Dan Nellian agrees with you. So thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan. Yes, absolutely. And the Battle of Berlin, it was a failure. I mean, the Battle of the Ruhr was a success. The Battle of Hamburg was a success. The Battle of Berlin was an absolute failure. And I think even Harrison knew that. I think and as Stephen said, it's kind of the realization that the bomber is not going to win the war on its own. That had been so many people's big claim back in the 1930s that we won't need to have ground division. We won't need to do that. The bomber will do it. And bombers absolutely made a huge influence in the Battle of World War II, but not on their own. That's the realization that's with the losses the 8th Air Force Bomber Command had. So brilliant stuff. So back to you. We'll move on.
Move on. So one of the things that I've got a particular issue with Franklin and Webster, who wrote the official history of the Bomber Command campaign. They said, and I don't know why they said this, they said that the offensive night fighter campaign was a failure. They said it caused minimal disruption. And I read, and one of the problems it was quite lazy on their part. They were focusing on the bombers. They were focusing on the bomber war. They were focusing on what Bomber Command did to the cities. They weren't really looking at the night fighter campaign. It was a sideshow for them, and they just basically looked at a load of stats and came to their conclusions from that, in my opinion. Because one of the things that people overlook is that it wasn't just a 100 group that was taking part in this campaign. ADGB, who were fighter command, who were fighting, and they were again fighter command before the end of the war. In November 43, fighter command, as it was split up into two. You've got TUTAF. They formed the bulk of TUTAF and Air Defence of Great Britain, whose remit was still to protect the airspace. And obviously the Germans weren't done because they had the Steinbock raids in January, so they were still doing what they were supposed to do. They were still protecting the airspace, but after the V1 threat, obviously threw things a little bit, and they had to protect the airspace from the V1 rockets, which were being launched day and night. But after the Channel coast was cleared in September 1944, and the launch ramps were overrun, the Germans started air launching V1s from Heinkel's, but it wasn't particularly effective, and they weren't able to launch very many. So that the as it was called, the diver campaign was scaled back, and fighter command began to take on more and more bomber support duties, and you sort of got more and more of them being flown until in February they flew 256 bomber support ops, and they knocked down quite a few aircraft. They were a handy adjunct to the main effort, and the same thing was with 85 Group, which obviously I'll mention next. I think the next slide is 85 Group. So 85 Group were a component of 2nd Tactical Air Force, and their job was beachhead defence. So they went over with the in the wake of the troops, and they started establishing airfields in Normandy. And not only were they building them, they were also defending them as well. And they had 6 night fighter squadrons, all equipped with Mosquito Mark 13s, which were excellent variants of the aircraft. And their job was initially defensive. And they were, because obviously the Germans were chucking quite a lot of ordnance at the beachhead and at the rear areas, which again is a story that's not particularly talked about. And they were going up every night and shooting down these aircraft. And they also had a remit to range 35 miles behind the front line. And they were ground controlled as well. They were able to take mobile ground control stations over, and the ground control stations would vector them onto the aircraft, and then they'd use their airborne interceptor radar, much the same way that the Germans were doing. But the Great Swan changed all that, because the Great Swan then pushed the front line right up to the Dutch-German border. And what it meant is that they were able then to range into German airspace. And they became more and more involved with bomber support duties, sort of by default, really. I mean, their remit was still to protect the battlefield and still protect the rear areas, but they were able to sort of join in with the fight over Germany as well. And they became pretty efficient. And because they were ground controlled, they kind of had the upper hand really over the other two, because they were able to get these ground control stations quite far advanced, and it took them into enemy airspace. And they were a great help to 100 Group when it came to actually taking the fight to the Germans at the end of the year, because autumn of 1944 and the winter of 1944 was the key time. That was the key moment when they were really able to. It all came together.
Yeah, I would say, I would kind of echo that era was the era of communications being the key deciding factor, not just in air ops, but everything. You know, that you look at how artillery is being used and armor and infantry cooperation. It's the communications, you know, the ground controller units, the ability, the phantom GHQ liaison regiment sending messages back. It's if 42, 43 was perhaps the era of the specialist tech, 44 was the era of improved communications, I think, generally. We hadn't got things perfectly, but there's a lot more of a netting and a system in place.
Yeah, absolutely. So now you've got three separate organisations who are still doing, who are now involved in taking the fight to the night fighters, which is obviously very different to how it was at the start of the year.
Yeah,
and also the Germans were hampered by the fact that they were losing their radar coverage. So previously they had their radars on the coast, the fray radars on the coast, they were able to see across into the UK. They're able to see the aircraft in much the same way that the chain home were able to do during the Battle of Britain in 1940, able to see the aircraft forming up over their home airfields. They lost all that capability, so they basically were blind in one eye, and they didn't have as much time to react to what was going on. So if we move on to the next slide, I just want to very, very quickly, and I will make this quick because I know we're sort of been 50 minutes already.
No, but it's great. We're loving it. Don't worry. It's fantastic.
These were two of the night fighter crews that I think are worth mentioning. Now, you'll notice that one of them shares my name, but he is no relation, unfortunately. I wish he was. It'd be quite cool if he was. But so the first guys, I mentioned Bob Brame already and Stitz Gregory. They were effectively the pioneers. They were the ones who shot down the first night fighter. They flew with 29 Squadron and 141 Squadron. Like all of the these night fighter crews, they cut their teeth in a defensive capability over the UK. Bob Brame actually shot his first aircraft down on the 24th of August 1940 during the Battle of Britain as a night fighter. And he was the most decorated fighter command airman of the war. And if you see DSO 2 bars, DFC 2 bars, Air Force Cross, CD is a Canadian decoration. And his NAVOP, Bill Gregory, Stitz Gregory, he wasn't far behind him really. So funny enough, Braham ended up the war in a prisoner of war camp because although both him and Stitz Gregory were eventually assigned to the staff of 2 Group, they were allowed to fly, or Bob Brame was allowed to fly a mission a week because he didn't like being behind a desk, and he was a bit itchy, and so he was allowed to fly a mission a week. And on the 25th of June 1944, he took off with an Aussie guy as an AVOP, and they flew to Denmark. Day Ranger it was called, to basically try and shoot at whatever they could. And they ran into a number of Focke-Wulf 190s, and one of them shot him down. And they crash landed on the beach on a beach in Denmark, and were taken prisoner and ended up spending the last year of the war in a prisoner of war camp. Funny enough, the guy who shot him down was a guy called Robert Spreckles, and he ended up becoming very, very good friends with Bob Brame, and even wrote the foreword to his autobiography. So yeah, that's him. And the bottom two, Brant Burbridge, who's on the right hand side there, he actually started the war as a conscientious objector. he was from a very but they were both from a really very religious background, and he was from a pacifist, and his father was a Wesleyan minister, a Methodist preacher, and when war broke out in September 1939, he registered as a conscientious objector, but he did change his tune in September 1940. Whether the Battle of Britain had anything to do with that or the Blitz, I don't know. But he wanted to join the Air Force, even though he'd never actually shown any interest in flying. And the reason why he wanted to join the Air Force is because he figured that if he was a pilot, he could shoot down a machine and not a man. It doesn't always work that way, I know, but that was his logic behind it. And they were actually the most highly decorated. They met at an OTU, and Bill Skelton, who was his NAVOP, he was of similar mind. And they met at an OTU, and they just sort of gelled together as a team. Both very religious, both entered their respective churches after the war. And they were the highest scoring Nightfighter pairing of the entire war. I know Graham had 29. He had 29 kills, but they weren't all at night. And so they were the most highest scoring Nightfighter crew of the war. But not many folk have heard of him. He only died relatively recently, Burbridge. He had Alzheimer's, unfortunately. But before his Alzheimer's became too debilitating, he allowed someone to come in and write his biography, which he cooperated with. And I've got that on the Kindle because it's hard to get hold of in a paper copy. But it's a good read. It's a good read, and I thoroughly enjoyed sort of finding out about him and about what motivated him. So I just thought I'd mention those two because they're worth mentioning in the context of this presentation, because it's a bit of a human touch to find out who the people were who were actually doing the job.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah. So move on now to what was the last chapter of my dissertation, and this was the best part, in my opinion. This was the bit when you really found out what it was all about, because at the end of the war, Schleswig-Holstein was an area of North Germany near the Danish border that wasn't really fought over, and it was the area, in fact, that most people fled to try and avoid the Russians on the one hand and the Western Allies on the other hand. So it was also an important area for night fighting because it covered the northern route to Berlin, and it was also quite close to Hamburg and Bremen. So there was a sort of a fairly substantial and undamaged and complete night fighter setup there. So only about a week or so after VE Day, the RAF were made aware of this, and they very quickly sent out a panel of 12 officers to go there and to debrief whoever they found. And there were a lot of people waiting there, sort of waiting to be told what to do. They didn't know. No one was telling them where to go or what to do. So they were there with their aircraft, with their airfields, and it was a gold mine. And in the sort of spirit of peace, there was cooperation. There was a good deal of sort of socializing, and a lot of interviewing went on. And one of the things that became quite apparent is the senior officers and the controllers, their word was not to be trusted, because they were normally concerned with protecting their post-war reputation. So they were saying things like, "Oh well, you didn't really bother us much. It was we were." Beppo Schmidt was one of them, who was Goering's sort of like fibber in chief for most of the war. He was one of the ones who told the interviewers that you didn't do much. We weren't worried by you at all. And then they spoke to the crews, the actual practitioners, who told a very different story. And it was the crews who were able to confirm to the panel that they really were in a state over what the RAF, the Offensive Night Fighter campaign, had been doing to them. And I kind of identified in my research, because there's files at the National Archives about this, and I kind of identified 5 main reasons as to why, as to what effect the night fighters had on their sort of German counterparts. And firstly was the rumour mill, which effectively everybody believed that the British night fighters were there to attack them at every stage of their mission. At the start, whilst they were circling the fighter beacons, in the bomber stream, on the way back to their airfield, and at their airfield. They were almost right, but the bomber stream was never really a happy hunting ground, because effectively, with all the bombers showing up on the radar screen, it looked like it was just chaos and carnage. So so that was the only part of the mission where they didn't tend to attack their German counterparts. So they would disobey established orders and protocols regarding height, tactics, and use of assembly beacons. So assembly beacons were spread out all over occupied Europe, and effectively, fighters were to circle the assembly beacons whilst the controllers worked out where the bomber stream was headed and what the best place to intercept them would be. And then obviously they'd say, right, okay, fly in this direction and you should hit the bomber stream. But unfortunately, the Belgian resistance had got hold of a copy of the location of the beacons, and so they were paid special attention by the RAF night fighters, and to the extent that the Nachtjagd were flying were flying at 150 feet because they thought we won't get attacked down here. And they called it Knight's Cross height, because if you were to fly any higher than that, you wouldn't receive your Knight's Cross. So right. Yeah, so but this had a knock-on effect, which meant that obviously by the time that they were able to get to the corresponding height, they were late arriving at the point when they were meant to intercept the bomber stream, and the bombers had often dropped their bombs and gone home. So they missed an awful lot of targets because they were flying so low, because they were fearful of what was going to happen to them if they flew any higher. The non-compliance of orders regarding the operation of the IFF beacon. Well, in the autumn of 1944, the TRE had introduced a new gizmo called Perfectos, and Perfectos would interrogate the Germans' IFF beacon, so they would know where these aircraft were. So the IFF beacon didn't even have to be turned on; they would still be able to trigger it, intercept it, to operate it, and then they would know where they were. But the Germans didn't. Officially, the Germans said no, they don't have anything like that. But the pilots knew better, and they thought, well, we're not going to use our IFF beacons. But this had an added knock-on effect in that they, if they refused to put their IFF beacons on, which they were supposed to do, this is identification of friend or foe. This is to stop them being shot down by their own side, effectively. And what it meant was that the flak batteries were seeing them as enemies. So they were, and one guy who was interviewed, who was an ME-262 pilot who had a friend who was shot down 3 times over Berlin by his own flak because he still refused to operate his IFF beacon. So he was more concerned about being shot down by mosquitoes than he was by being shot down by his own flak, which at this point was highly accurate, radar guided, and it just goes to show that he saw that as being the lesser of two evils. So dishonesty during post-action debriefs. So they weren't basically telling them the truth. They weren't telling their debriefing officers what they wanted. They weren't saying that they were patrolling the beacons at 150 feet, and they weren't saying that they weren't saying they were turning their IFF off. And part of that was fear, and part of that was being forced. They were worried that they were going to be forced to do what they didn't want to do. And then you've got an almost reverent level of respect for British kit, for the Mosquito and the AI, and this went hand in hand with a rapidly growing sort of dissatisfaction with their own. So this is, and I thought this was a style used during my dissertation. This shows you just how good the 100 Group AI Mark 10 aircraft were good at getting at their job. And December 1944 is the month, and there's a further slide about this. This was the month where it was the equivalent of May 1943 for the U-boats. This was when it was a catastrophe for them. And you can see from that there were 95 AI contacts from 100 Group Mosquitoes in December 1944. And of that, there were 40 claims. So nearly half of the contacts were being translated into claims, 42.1%. So they were getting good. They were on top of their game by this point. And if you go to the next slide, yep. So it was a catastrophe for the Nachtjagd. One of the interesting things that came up, and this was mentioned by a number of crews in the debriefs, was an event that happened on the 5th of December when for some reason the controllers vectored them onto a trap. They identified a number of mosquitoes from 100 Group and from 2 TAF as being bombers, and they sent them up, and they were massacred. No losses at all to the RAF night fighters, but they lost 6 or 7 or 8, I think, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're not putting that many up, it's a lot. They were losing huge numbers in terms of how many aircraft they were actually putting up. The Battle of the Bulge is interesting. the Germans doing what they do, making fantastic decisions by this point in the war. And about the Battle of the Bulge was an awful decision, but what they decided to do was they decided to use night fighters and their crews as low-level strafers by night, attacking the rear areas. So you've got expensive aircraft, expensively trained crews who were basically being picked out of the sky by US flak and by British and American night fighters who they had a field day. They lost 75 night fighters and crews just in the course of the first week of the Battle of the Bulge. It was a waste. It was an absolute waste. It should never have happened. And it put them in a really, really bad place for the start of 1945. And then you've got I've picked out some other individual raids where on the 17th, 18th of December, they lost 16 night fighters. This was all bomber support. This wasn't anything to do with the Bulge losses. 23rd, 24th, they lost 14. 24th, 25th, they lost 13. Really, it was these losses were now. We were talking about Bomber Command having unsustainable losses. Well, now it was the night fighter force that were having unsustainable losses, and they just couldn't keep up with them. They were losing many more than they were shooting down, which never, you wouldn't expect that to happen. That wasn't part of the plan. So, did the RAF defeat the Nachtjagd? Well, the conclusion that I came to in my dissertation was that they absolutely did, despite what Franklin and Webster say, despite what anybody else who's got something to say about this would say. It was a comprehensive defeat, and it was a defeat that was as total, in my opinion, as the U-boats being beaten in May 1943. Yep, they still took off and they still shut down bombers, but when I say other factors are in play, they had a crippling fuel shortage at this point. So they weren't able to send up very many aircraft at all in 1945. 1945 was a lean time for the RAF because, and this is one of the questions that they put to the panel put to their opposite numbers, and they said, why did we not shoot many down in 45? And they said, well, firstly, the weather was appalling, which hindered operations, and secondly, we didn't have the fuel, so we were only able to send up the experts, only able to send up the guys who knew what they were doing. We weren't going to send up, new crews or crews with just one or two victories because that was a waste of fuel. They weren't going to have the impact that the experts were going to have. Electronic countermeasures by this time were really hit the straps. They were spoofing the Germans every single night. They were setting up mandrel screens, which were you basically fly along a line, you drop a window, and then the bomber stream bursts through this, and they don't know until the last moment where it's going. So ECM was really hitting its straps. Night fighter morale was plummeting. The quoted stats, I think Franklin and Webster were quite keen to quote that the 100 group shot down 249 enemy night fighters with another 16 possibles. But what that doesn't actually include are the aircraft that crashed because they were flying at treetop height to get to the beacons to avoid the attention to the mosquitoes. It didn't factor in the disruption that made the night fighters less effective because they were too busy looking behind them. They were too busy taking evasive action. They were weaving left, right, and centre, and this is and also obviously the quoted stats reflected the losses caused by night fighters, not those inflicted by them, which was a good deal higher. It doesn't include 2 TAF, 85 group. It doesn't include fighter command, and you've got the evidence of the night fighter crews and the post-war debriefs. And the Nuremberg Raid, in my opinion, was a Pyrrhic victory and a catalyst for defeat. It never was as good for the Nachtjagd again as it was on that particular night. And that's the conclusion I came to, and that was basically the end of my dissertation. And I thoroughly enjoyed writing it, and I particularly enjoyed writing the chapter about the.
Well, we can tell by your smile there, and fantastic presentation. And someone just said a minute ago, we don't like these wishy-washy, not you've made your conclusion, you've said it. You're not Yeah, brilliant stuff. So we've got some questions are just too big rabbit holes to go down, but a few that I want you to address now. Well, Stephen is referencing A Thousand Shall Fall by Murray Pedden is a good account of the B-17 with number 100 group. So I don't know whether you've read that book, but he's recommending that.
I haven't, and I would like to. Definitely. That's
okay. Trevor Sheehan is saying, what influence did Moonlight have on Nightfighter ops?
That's a good question. I'm afraid I can't answer that one. I haven't looked it up. I mean, I suppose what I would say is that I've not come across a single instance of a Allied night fighter being shot down by its opposite number.
Okay.
So certainly, I mean, it may have happened. I've not come across it. I have looked to see whether. I mean, Flak claimed a few. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Norma. Flak claimed a few, and obviously crashes and technical faults. But I'm not aware of any night fighters that were shot down by their counterparts. So what I would say is, as far as that was concerned, it didn't have any effect on them. Didn't make them more vulnerable.
Okay.
It certainly made the bombers more vulnerable, and they did try and avoid moonlit nights because they obviously Nuremberg was a surprise and shouldn't have. It wasn't predicted that it would happen that way. But as far as night fighter operations are concerned, I can't really answer that question in terms of how it affected it. But certainly they didn't lose anybody. So thank you very much.
Trevor. Okay. Well, it's always good when we don't know an answer. It gives us room to explore things in the future. So Ian T, and thanks for your donation with a tip there, financial tip earlier, Ian. Who, if anyone, coordinated the various night fighter units so that they didn't clash in 44, 45? So, we've talked with people like Dilip Almin about, RAF Uxbridge doing all its control of the battle group, but who controls this stuff? Because night, tech, radar, is someone in overall control of this?
Well, the answer is I don't know. There was a meeting in January 1945, which was convened all three representatives of all three groups, and what they were asking is, can we find some way of giving 100 group and fighter command access to 85 groups ground control radar,
right?
Which obviously would have meant some sort of coordination, but that didn't. It was, everyone agreed what a fantastic idea, we should do that, but it didn't really happen. So again, it was like one of these things where it's a great idea in paper, but practicalities were a little bit difficult. As for the question, again, I don't know. I imagine there was some kind of liaison between the three groups, but because there must have been, because the incident on the 5th of December, when the night fighters were led into a trap, that was a joint operation between 100 group and 2nd Tactical Air Force.
Well, it means there's a potential for a volume 2 of the bottle when you look at a book, when you do into other details later on. So there were lots of discussions in the sidebar about the legend of carrots giving people better eyesight that we know is mainly bollocks and that. But there are a couple of serious questions about, were there any special eye tests for night fighter pilots? And Andreas asked, were there mission limits on night? So basically, the overall question is, if the night fighters, and by this, I guess we're meaning German or Allied, are there special physical requirements that apply just to people fighting at night in terms of what they can do, or special training or eyesights?
Well, going back to what you said earlier about carrots, this was designed to protect Mark IV airborne interceptor.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a conceal the truth with a bullshit story to the public, and it got rid of carrots as well. It was to get rid of the carrot mountain, because my dad's father, I didn't know my grandfather. My dad's father was a fire watcher on the roofs of London, and he after hearing about this would eat plates of carrots before going and standing on the top of his factories, and he would say, "No, I definitely can see better." But it's placebo.
I mean, I don't know. I don't. I've heard about something called keratin that's meant to improve your eyesight, but again, it might be one of these legends that said this sort of survived, was thoroughly thought up by the authorities in 1940, because John Cunningham obviously was meant to be Cat's-Eyes Cunningham.
Yeah, Cat's-Eyes Cunningham. Yeah,
but he had interviews with the press where he said, "Oh, I eat lots of carrots," but in actual fact, it was Mark IV airborne interceptor radar, ground controlled, that was putting him behind the enemy bombers that were enabling him to shoot them down. I don't actually know about the eye test. I'm sorry, I'm not being very good on this, but
well, that's the thing about World War II TV audience. They'll all always throw questions at historians that take them down paths they never thought of. That's what they do.
I've seen photos of German Nightfighter aircraft sitting around in their sort of dispersal huts with dark glasses on. So obviously there was some effort to try and accustom pilots to the darkness and the night before.
John says the Japanese Navy tested for night vision, so that's something that John. So there's a factoid there that comes in. So well, here's one. It's not a question; it's a comment. Great. I love it when we're doing a show and someone then has a connection with a story. So you said that Branson Burbridge is not a relative of yours, but Howie in the audience says he once had lunch with Branson in my auntie's house in Oxford in the 80s. As a 12-year-old, I told him all I knew about the mosquito. He just smiled, didn't realize till I got his book. So someone's met Burbridge back there. So I love those little connections there. So maybe you want to get in touch.
I would love to do
it there and share some stories there. So that's a great little bit of extra stuff there. And then the last question really I'm going to put is from Sean Brennan. And you talked about the Luftwaffe conclusions there. He said, if mosquito panic was a real factor for German fighter crews, did the Luftwaffe ever specifically target night fighters and vectors specialist fighters towards them? So then the hunters become the hunted, then become the hunted again.
Yeah.
So did the Luftwaffe then try and do something about the units that are going after? Then it gets, I'm getting complicated. Who's after who now? But was it a thing?
It wasn't a thing. I mean, one thing I will say,
they don't have the capability now, do they? To do
no,
stuff?
Exactly. Yeah. They just didn't. The Heinkel 219, which I think you might be aware of, was a specialist. It was one of only 2 aircraft that were built primarily as a night fighter. The other one being the P-61 Black Widow, which was built by the Americans with the specific role of being a night fighter. Didn't do anything else. The Heinkel 219 was the only aircraft the Germans would put up against mosquitoes. And I don't necessarily mean mosquito night fighters. I'm talking about the Pathfinders and the light striking force, because it was the only aircraft that was deemed to be able to go up against them with anything like equality. As it was, Cam Huber, when he was interviewed in General Cam Huber, when he was interviewed in August 1945, he actually said the Heinkel 219, it wasn't a match for the mosquito. It never was. It was just the best we had. And it looks kind of quite sort of cool with its with its cockpit right forward. It had an ejector seat. It was the only aircraft that was issued with an ejector seat in them. The reason why it had an ejector seat is because you couldn't bail out of it, because if you bailed out of it, you'd end up in the propellers. Because of the way that the propellers were configured with the cockpit, they were if you tried to bail out of it, you'd be chewed to pieces. So they had to put an ejector seat in to sort of send the crew clear of the aircraft itself. But that was it was a good aircraft. It was a good fighter, but it wasn't really. It was never really. It never bested the mosquito by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I think we will end things there because there's lots to discuss about aviation, but we'll save that for another time. We've been doing this for some time. So, Stuart, fantastic debut performance there. We look forward to welcoming you back in the future. Tomorrow, folks, we're talking about the first war crimes trials in Romania. So, Romanians who are serving alongside the Third Reich committing some nasty atrocities. That's a panel discussion, and then lots more stuff coming your way next week. So, as always, they're still arguing about carrots, and the carrots do generally improve your eyes, but they don't give you a magic ability to see in the dark. That's it's there, but they get it. I mean, I've never had an argument break out about carrots, but do your research, folks. But don't forget to click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, visit their websites, do their stuff. But fantastic start. So, folks,
thank you very much indeed, and thanks everybody.
Thanks, Stuart. I'll see you all tomorrow, folks. So this is Paul Willett for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.